On this episode, I catch up with singer-songwriter Michael Duguay. Michael and I met some years back and have shared the love of music, among other things, and today I get to pick his brain about his journey into music, first shows and tours, time spent out of country, as well as getting into some of the heavier issues such as addiction and mental health. He also released a YouTube exclusive video EP. We hear about how that came to be and his plans for the rest of the year. All this and more today on The Bomb with AUZZY. Welcome back to The Bomb with AUZZY, the most explosive podcast in Kingston, Ontario. And friends, today I'm joined with singer-songwriter Michael Duguay. Michael, thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure, Austin. Thanks for having me.
So off the bat, you've been involved in so many projects in the years and you've made so much music. Let's just briefly touch on where it all started for you. How old were you when you started your journey into music? Like, how old were you when you knew it's kind of what you wanted to do for a career?
You know, I think it existed as a passion before it was something that I actually pursued. I grew up in a hockey town. I grew up in Peterborough.
Right.
I grew up in a hockey family. Sports were just sort of, you know, the presumed lifestyle. It was sort of just what was expected of me, I guess. And so, you know, I had this desire, I had this love for music and this desire to explore it before I kind of had the guts to go to my parents and say that I didn't want to do sports and that I'd prefer to get into music and other creative stuff. But professionally, you know, I knew it was what I wanted to do professionally pretty quickly into doing it, into that exploration. I would say by mid-high school, I had pretty much made up my mind for sure.
Oh, and when you told your parents you didn't want to play music or didn't want to do sports and you were kind of more interested in music, were they supportive of you?
Yeah, they were pretty gracious about it. I think that you know, given my skill level, it was probably no major surprise that I was moving in a direction away from athletics. You know, skills and interests. Like I just never had that, you know, like adolescent athletes or you know, young people who are playing sports,
Mm-hmm.
you know, probably don't drag their heels too much to have to go to games and stuff like that. And I certainly did it, you know. So they were understanding and certainly supportive for sure. I think once they wrapped their mind around it, you know, to this day, I think that my parents don't always totally understand exactly what it is that I do and how I spend my time, but all things considered, they've supported it, you know, in the beginning as a hobby and a passion, and moving forward as a career.
That's awesome. And what was the first instrument you picked up?
Piano, keyboards.
Really?
Yeah. I had a little. Actually, I still have it. It's funny. My mom, you know, that thing that parents do that every time you go to their house, they give you like one object that you left there 20 years ago when you moved out.
Yep.
One of the recent ones was my I guess my first keyboard. And I guess I would predate my sort of coming to my parents and telling them that I wanted to do it. I think I had the keyboard first and I would sort of tinker on it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just one of those little, like, you know, 90s Radio Shack keyboards with some built-in rhythms and tone banks and that sort of thing. And I would just mess around with that, sort of emulate songs that I heard on the radio, or I was a kid in North America. So like, you know, Disney movie songs, that sort of stuff, just mess around with that. And so when it came time, all of this sort of coalesced around like the beginning of high school, which I'm sure is a pretty dominant narrative with young artists.
Right.
Not like a vocational art school, but definitely an arts leaning school. And just, you know, immediately met a bunch of other young people who had this interest, but never really had the opportunity to explore it. So it became this, you know, this sort of, you know, community of friends who we were all learning about music and becoming musicians and music listeners and, you know, whatever our artistic pursuits at the time were. I guess I started kind of taking, can't even really call them piano lessons. I met a buddy in early high school. He lived out in the country and his folks had a bit of money. So they had like a shed out back, or like this nice, like, you know, and so we started going out there on the weekends and, you know, we were listening to, this is the year 2000, right? So
okay, yeah.
A lot of the stuff that was on the radio was like, I was coming out of, in elementary school, I'd been listening to a lot of, you know, new metal and that like Y2K era, and beginning to, you know, as soon as I got to high school, like I said, it was like, I was introduced to so much cool music and a lot of stuff that I still listen to this day. But that was a group of folks that I met who were interested in that sort of new metal stuff. So we would just go out there and just, you know, play that kind of stuff. And it was a blast. It was really cool. And so he had a guitar teacher who was this sort of cool, interesting, quirky, old hippie dude who lived in downtown Peterborough and taught lessons out of his house. I don't know if this is what he did for all students, but it's what he appeared to be doing for my friend Ryan. And then sort of provided to me was that he had this sort of recording setup, this multi-track recording setup, and Ryan was like making CDs with them. Like he'd go there for his, lesson hour or whatever and just record stuff, like compose and record stuff on his computer. We recorded, I'm trying to remember the name that we released it under, but we recorded 2 tracks. Alien Astronaut, it might have been Alien Astronaut, might have been the name. In any event, and then so I had met this guy George, and he would so I signed up for these lessons with him, and it was pretty funny. Like I'd go over and I'd be like, I want to learn like this Radiohead song. He'd be like, well, I'm just going to show you this like King Crimson song instead. Like he would just like kind of force me to learn like stuff that he was into, which I think like he was definitely trying to usher me towards, music that he was interested in, and despite what his opinions on the stuff I was interested in at that time. But it certainly didn't stunt my growth, like being able to go once a week. I think I did this for a couple of years, where I'd go to his place, and he wasn't really formally teaching me piano stuff, but like he'd be like showing me this King Crimson tune and be like, oh, what the keyboard is doing here is like this sort of thing, or like, this is, he'd kind of embed music theory in the process of learning these songs and then apply it to these recordings that we were doing. So I was also learning about, sort of how to be a producer, how to be a collaborator,
Right.
how to, we were definitely meeting in the middle with a lot of this stuff. And yeah, that was, I guess, really the beginning of me sort of songwriting more formally and developing my own ideas into sort of concrete tunes and pieces.
So when it came to finally taking the music to playing shows, did you first start out with bands, or did you start solo doing your singer-songwriter stuff when you first were doing your first live shows?
No, the singer-songwriter stuff came later, for sure. When I was in grade 9, I started playing with some other folks that were in my year in high school. I think the first time I performed was at like a Christmas assembly, and we performed Everybody Hurts by REM, which is pretty rad. And then like by the end of that year, me and those friends, we played one more at like an end of year thing where we played a full set. And the drummer in that band, he was playing with a group of musicians who were like a year to like 3 years older. Like, and I kind of got ushered into that scene, I think by virtue really of being a keyboardist. And that's where the doors really opened. Like that was where I started, it would be less of like going out with my buddies and like smoking a ton of pot and maybe playing some music, to like dedicated, like we're going to play music, and like we, also smoked a ton of pot.
Right.
That was a lot of sort of, jam oriented stuff, like listening to a lot of, that's when I got into the Grateful Dead, who are a band that have really shaped my interests and way that I like to workshop ideas. Got into jazz for the first time, was listening to a lot of like, the popular titles, the Coltrane, the Miles Davis, the Thelonious Monk, that kind of stuff. But yeah, like not only learning a lot about playing music, but like learning about how to be a member of like a creative unit, like how to be in a band, how to sort of have healthy relationships in those contexts. Looking back at that time in my life, I feel like I was incredibly blessed to be surrounded by a group of peers who, we were all just really, really into just playing music all the time. But yeah, what happened there was we played in this, I remember in this battle of the bands, there were bands from every high school that played, and we won. We came first place. And so we got like $500 or something. And then like just sort of developed a bit of a following. And the first show we did what in retrospect was pretty clever, which was we like asked the bands that we met at this battle of the bands, we asked them all to open for us. So it was a 5-band bill. Friday night, downtown Peterborough, and like line up around the block, just like sold out theater. And I'm like 15 or whatever, 16, and just like so stoked. Eventually, I was writing more and more of my own tunes, and then I played a couple shows. Like that band started fading out. Like, and I think we just kind of got tired of playing just in this sort of like white boy suburban Peterborough funk band. And I had been composing some of my own stuff and started playing with the bass player and the drummer from that band. We were playing as a trio, and then eventually, what happened was just that whole band of the Funk Odyssey just turned into my band, and started playing my song. Yeah, we started playing my band. We called ourselves the Special Lights. We were named after the brand of smokes that I smoked, the Benson and Hedges Special Lights. Yeah, and like, I had the option to go to university right out of high school. I got accepted to Ryerson to study theater, and I decided not to. I decided to stay in Peterborough and to play in those bands and be part of the scene. I had met a number of older musicians by that point as well, folks in their 20s and 30s who I had started playing with, and just kind of, I guess, making a bit of a name for myself in that small, pretty vibrant, albeit quite insular community. And from there, yeah, just I started playing with more older musicians and getting picked up in bands that were more active and touring outside of the city and the province, and it just kind of went from there.
Well, that's actually kind of one of the next things I have in my notes here is that since knowing you, you've always had such vibrant and extravagant touring stories, and to the point where it sounds like for a few years you were a bit of a nomad where the road was your home. I would just wanted to get a bit more into that. When did you really start doing more of the touring with bands? What age and how long would you say that was going on for?
Quite young. I think my first tour, like where I probably would have only gone as far as maybe, Montreal, but I'd done, did the Ontario circuit. I was probably 19. But it started getting more extensive. I started playing in a band out of Peterborough called the Burning Hell, who they're still a band to this day. Started playing with them because they were, like about 10 years older than me. They had their sights set on a certain sort of trajectory, which involved a whole lot of touring, which, left to my own devices, I wouldn't have probably been doing on my own at that time.
Mm-hmm.
I have a distinct memory. I guess I would have been 20, and I was on tour with this band that I played in for a number of years out of Peterborough called the Unionist Ministers, who were sort of like a country rockabilly band. And we toured around Ontario and then did our last night, and it was in Montreal. And then Matthias Kalm, who's the singer and the front person of the Burning Hell, the night after the show in Montreal, picked me up in the parking lot behind the venue that we had played at. And then we began an East Coast tour.
Oh my goodness.
I really remember that moment. Again, I was like 20 and it just clicked for me. It's like, this is the life I want. This is the lifestyle I want, right? Like I don't want to ever go home. Like I just want to, I just want to, see the world and play music. And truthfully, I just, wanted to party a lot and meet new people and that sort of thing. So yeah, just started touring quite a bit. And that project, The Burning Hell, like they had a pretty serious interest in pretty extreme touring, like going to places that maybe bands don't normally go.
Could you have any examples?
Like a lot of like Northern Scandinavia, Eastern Europe.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Northern Canada. That was the first time I ever went up to the Yukon, which is a place I continue to spend a lot of time was with that project. Going to places like, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic, places that, some bands go but most bands don't, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. That band, actually, I was not playing on this tour, but the Burning Hell have a record for the most amount of shows in the most countries in 24 hours. They did 10 shows in 10 countries in 24 hours.
Whoa.
Like serious plane, trains, and automobiles sort of situation, and time zone jumping.
Yeah, no doubt.
But that's, even though I wasn't there for that, that is an example of like the sort of project that I cut my teeth in, right? Was like, let's do this. Like, let's do it hard. Let's do it in ways that are unconventional and maybe even sort of funny and wild. And that's definitely, that definitely affected the way that I think at that time really sort of, it contributed to this vision I had for my future and the way that I wanted to pursue that career.
And you've been pretty much everywhere from what you just said there. What are some of your favorite places that you've got to travel with music so far?
Well, I mean, I think anyone who's done a lot of touring will probably say the same thing, that it's like, most of the time doesn't matter where it is, you're pulling up to a venue, you're sound checking. If you're lucky, you might be able to go for a walk for a couple hours before you have to get back for doors open. You play your set, you clean up, you go to, a hotel or whoever's floor you're sleeping on, depending on the tour. We spent a fair bit of time in Berlin, and that was a city that I got to know maybe a little bit better than others. And at that time, just a really beautiful place to be. And I grew quite fond of it. But probably, like I mentioned earlier, I've continued to have a relationship with the Yukon and the music community in the Yukon territory ever since the first time I went up there. And I guess it was 2009. I guess I would have to say that's a place that I was introduced to through music that has remained one of my favorite places in the world, and a place that is really dear to my heart.
So over the last year, actually, you've put out quite a bit of music. 2 albums and an EP, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yeah, well, technically an album and then a compilation of remixes and reinterpretations and covers of songs from that other album by my friends, and then an EP. Yeah.
And so that actually kind of half answers what I was going to ask is it new material or stuff that you wrote when you were younger that you're repurposing now as an adult?
No, it's all new material.
Where does all that come from? Because that's quite a bit of material. And I know that people kind of write music at their own pace, but Does it just flow to you, or do you put the time in?
Well, it's been an interesting trajectory. Like I said, I stopped playing music from about 2012 to 2018. And during those 6, 7 years, I was quite unhealthy and struggling quite a bit. And so, I mean, I wasn't writing at all during that time, like not sort of formally. I was, music was on my mind, but it wasn't something that I was actively trying to pursue because, I had things standing in my way. But I had to overcome some personal stuff and some pretty serious health stuff in order to get back to playing music. And also I should mention there were also times in there I was completely ambivalent about it. Like I had no intention of returning to music. But some things fell into place and I realized, I had the same sort of experience that I had like when I was 20 or even when I was like 15, where I was like, no, this is why I'm on this earth. Like I tried a few other things, some to like varying degrees of success, but nothing ever felt authentic to me. Nothing ever felt like it was really sort of like satiating my like spiritual hunger, my desires to walk, a genuine path. And then like the moment I decided to start playing music again, it was just so clear that was how I ought to be spending my time. So I could say that I was sort of making up for lost time, but it wasn't really that intentional. I wasn't sitting down thinking, oh, I got to make up for lost time here. I just started,
Right, yeah.
just started writing. And I think I've always been pretty prolific. Like when I was younger in songwriting, like, songs came to me pretty quickly, but also when I was young, like I remember in high school, I have a number of siblings and they all had summer jobs. And I sort of like, I convinced my parents that music was my job. This was how I was spending my time. And I was pretty serious, in living up to that. Like I had a routine as a young person where I would wake up every morning and sit down at my piano and compose. And so that has been the way that I've approached it again now in my life, that, this is my job and this is my calling. And I recognize that a huge part of that is, getting up every morning and treating it like a job. And, a lot of it is administrative and a lot of it is less creative than I would like it to be. But as things progress, I have more kind of support, more people on my team who do the administrative stuff well. And I can focus my energy on the creative side of things. So, in 2018, when I came back to playing and had that, had that realization that I needed to get back on this path. I didn't immediately jump into music as a full-time thing because that would be pretty reckless. And I was at a point in my life where I was over making extremely reckless decisions. And for my own health and well-being, I had to, be strategic about how I went about it. When I did put pen to paper, I certainly had a lot to write about. I wasn't searching for things to write about. They were pretty present in my mind. And truthfully, like there were things that I sort of had to get on paper as an act of catharsis in order to sort of move on from personal things as well.
Well, I actually have that written down here. Is that on the last few albums, your lyrics are very transparent in the sense it almost feels like on some of the songs reading a journal or a diary where they're just so open and honest. So that does come across to the listener, at least.
Right on it. Yeah, I'm pleased to hear that. Thanks for saying so.
And you've mentioned several times throughout the interview so far the Yukon and your time in the Yukon. For everyone listening, can you just get into that a little more? What you're doing up there and how you even came about finding it?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, I went there for the first time in 2009 to play at the Dawson City Music Festival in July, late July or early August. Yeah, I just, I guess we all have these places in the world where we go and we're just, really smitten with them. And when I went up there to perform at that festival with that band, my best friend came up at that time as well. And he was particularly smitten, and he was smitten enough that he's essentially stayed there ever since. He's continued to live there since that time.
Oh, wow.
And so when I, kind of got back on my feet and returned to good health, I wanted to go see him. And, it had been on my mind ever since 2009 that I wanted to go back there. And in the time between 2009 and the first time I went back up there, which was 2018, I had just kind of constantly been running in circles with people who were from the Yukon or people who lived in the Yukon but came down here every once in a while. I was always sort of interacting with folks who had the same connections to the Yukon that I had to it. And so that meant there was a lot of people up there that I knew.
Right.
So it was pretty easy to put a trip together. So I wanted to go up see my buddy in Old Crow, but I decided that I should put a tour together around that since I was up there. And so I ended up playing in Whitehorse and Dawson City, which are sort of the two main places to play while you're up there. And that was in 2018. And then in 2019, knowing that I wanted to go back, the first year when I went up, I had performed, I'd done a small concert at Youth Center in Old Crow for community members there. And some community members there and folks who worked at the school invited me back to do a more sort of formal songwriting workshop with students at the school in Old Crow. So I took them up on that opportunity and then wanted to stay even longer in the Yukon. So I managed to get a contract teaching or facilitating and participating in a similar workshop at the high school in Dawson City, which is south of there. And then reached out to a producer who lives in Whitehorse. I ended up going to Whitehorse after, I'd spent a few days in Old Crow and then a week in Dawson City, and then went and spent a subsequent week in Whitehorse and began recording a record. The intention of returning in 2020 to complete that record. And of course, nothing in 2021 is planned for anybody, including myself. But fortunately, I was able to go back up in January of this year. Actually, I went up in December. I went up on Boxing Day because basically the Yukon right now has a really strict, policy about self-isolation when you arrive in the territory.
Okay, yeah.
And so knowing I had to get back up there to finish this project, but that I would have to self-isolate, I didn't, and then it would take about 2 weeks once I was there to finish the project. I didn't have the budget to rent a hotel room for a month, and I really didn't want to spend 2 weeks in a hotel room. So I just kind of waited it out until I had some friends who needed a house sitter for a couple of weeks. Friends of mine were coming down to Ontario for the holidays, and they needed someone to watch their place and their dog. And so I got to go up there in December and spent 2 weeks in self-isolation, and then I spent 2 weeks in the studio completing this project. So yeah, it's been a place where, each of those trips have meant more connections, more meaningful friendships, more collaborators. Each time I go there, I continue to, become part of a community that exists there, or develop a little bit of a community around me. And it's just become, a place that I'm certain I will continue to travel regularly for the remainder of my life.
Well, and like all my episodes that deal with any sensitive subject matter or sensitive topics to the individual, I always feel it a little necessary to let the listeners know that it has been discussed prior to the interview and I'm not just blindsiding the guest. But with that being said, you've had an on and off again battle with addiction. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
If you're comfortable with sharing, would you mind diving into that a little bit with us? If you're able to pinpoint the cause or the beginning, or was it sort of a snowball effect? And did it have to do with the industry, or was it a combination of things?
I guess I should clarify that, it was on and off again relationship with substances and substance abuse for a long time again. And now it is permanently off.
Congratulations.
I'm solidly in recovery now. I'm just a little over 2 years sober now.
Yeah.
It's hard to say. I experienced some trauma as a child, and then those were experiences that I really sort of genuinely repressed, the literal sense. Like I stopped thinking about them at a certain time in my life, and looking back now and like through the aid of therapy, I can pinpoint the time that I stopped sort of processing the trauma that I experienced as a kid as soon as I started drinking in my late preteens. And so, certainly, drinking and partying and stuff was always part of my life from that time. And,
right.
As I developed as a musician and as a member of like a creative community, I also just, I was developing as a person who liked a certain kind of nightlife. And those lines definitely got blurred, as I got older. So when I look back, and I say that like I didn't go to university when I finished high school because I wanted to stay and play in bands. That's true, but also I think part of it is I didn't go to university because I wanted to stay in the hometown that I was from,
right?
Be a barfly at the bar that I thought was this cool place that artists hung out at, and I did. Like that is exactly what I did. And I think that as I think the nature of this is stuff that I'm still processing and that I'm going to be processing for the remainder of my life. But the nature of addiction is that you sort of like you sort of accumulate trauma as you go, right? Because as an addict. Speaking for myself, I got myself in a lot of really, messed up situations, really harmful, scary situations. the nature again of that illness is that you don't process them in a healthy way. You just continue to block them out and just suppress them and suppress them and suppress them and just sort of block out the world. So I think I found myself in that sort of that pattern where I had got myself so deep into, at the beginning just drinking, but then increasingly into party drugs, and then increasingly into street drugs, and then by the end of it, anything I could get my hands on. For me, the nature of addiction, as I think it's sort of medically understood, but again, speaking from my own experience, is that like addiction doesn't mean that you're just getting messed up all the time, although I was, but it means that when you're not getting messed up, all you can think about is taking a drug or taking a drink or whatever to block out the world, right? And that's when it's the worst, and that's when it's the most painful. So, as I grew older and developed into my substance abuse issues, like the window of time that I could go without putting a substance into my body grew shorter and shorter and shorter. But not all substances are available to me at all times, right? So, yep. Not to be graphic, but if it meant drinking like a bottle of like rubbing alcohol, I would. It was that sort of thing, right? By the end of it, it meant that if I was on tour, a random person at a party offered me a random pill and I had no idea what it was, I would take it, and again, so I was getting myself into some pretty scary situations and not really processing it. And then I guess around 2009, the last sort of serious tour I did was actually that tour where I went to Dawson City for the first time. And I'd been on a European tour prior to that. The band I was playing in, we played at a pretty major music festival in Slovakia, like 80,000 people. It's on an old military, like Air Force base kind of thing. We were playing on a side stage, and it had been predicted that there would be some sort of inclement weather, but it didn't. We didn't know that we were getting into a pretty scary situation, and a windstorm just came out of nowhere and just tore through this festival. And it's like people camping, right? Like it's that kind of festival, right? Big tents, all that sort of stuff. It was while we were on stage, and we got like quickly ushered off the stage and sort of led to a bunkie. Again, it was an old Air Force base, to take cover. And while we were doing that, I mean, people's tents are flying through the air, create just wildness. And a number of tents at this festival collapsed, like the big, like music tents. We were being guided past one of these tents as they collapsed. It was like a DJ tent. So there was, a few thousand people in it, and it just fell on a bunch of people, and a bunch of people died. Again, not to be graphic, but I witnessed some pretty graphic death right in front of me. And that for me was like definitely a turning point in my life. That's when that was when I went from just taking any pill I was offered to seeking out any pill I could find.
When it went from bad to worse?
I ended up having panic attacks every single day. We had to cancel a bunch of shows because I couldn't leave where we were staying without having a panic attack. I almost couldn't fly home to Canada because I didn't think I could handle the flight, but came back and took a little bit of time off. And then I got brought on one last tour. And by this point I was just, I was a wreck, because like I had said, like I had that situation where I didn't even have an apartment because I was on tour all the time. But because I didn't have an apartment, I had to be on tour all the time. So when I got back to Canada, I was like, what am I going to do? I didn't go to university. Well, I did go to university for a couple of years actually, but I didn't really do anything. I didn't really have any other skills. Like I'd worked in a couple of restaurants, like a lot of artists, but I really didn't have anything that I could sink my teeth into. So I was just sort of, I was floundering, and I got brought on one last tour, and that was a tour where I went to the Yukon. And, by the end of that tour, I got sent home early from that tour. They didn't want to have me on it any longer because my behavior was just so reckless and did not reflect well on the other people in that band, right? And was not going to help the project. And earlier in my career, when I was like 20, it's amazing how quickly this can change. When I was 20, it was like, I think it was part of why people sometimes brought me along was I was a performer, like I was one of those musicians on stage who 30 seconds into the first song, like I'm standing on an amp, I'm doing backflips, like I'm
a rock star.
Exactly. Yeah. But like almost, I was like, I never aspired to be like, I was never like a macho dude. Like I never wanted to be like, Aerosmith or like, whatever. Like for me, it was about performance. It was almost like an ironic parody of that sort of thing. And that's what I was into. And people knew that about me. They knew that like, you bring me on the road and I'm gonna put on this almost sort of like vaudevillian parody of what it is to be a rock star. But then those lines really got blurred, right? And it's like where I wouldn't switch it off when the show ended. I'd go back to the hotel room and I would trash a hotel room, and like we weren't successful enough to have management cover those expenses. So like, and I didn't have any money, right? So this sort of stuff was happening. And then without that, without the opportunity to sort of be picked up and taken on the road for a few months at a time, 4 or 5 times a year, I had nothing. I really had nothing.
Right.
And so, things really, really fell apart pretty quickly at that point. And I left Peterborough. I moved out to the Maritimes, thinking that if I moved to another place, I would, be able to get a fresh start. But and so then, I'm in a small town in a province where I don't know anybody, and I start behaving the way I do when I'm intoxicated and freaked out, and people in turn were getting freaked out and not wanting to have anything to do with me. So I'm increasingly isolated. And then the next thing you know, I'm just back completely by myself, just getting high and drunk all the time. That went on for a couple of years. And then in 2014, I was arrested. I'd been arrested a number of times, but I was arrested kind of one last time, and I had to go to jail. And when I got out of my time spent in provincial jail there in New Brunswick, that was when I, after many years of being told by people around me I had to probably do something, that was the first time where I sort of considered that I ought to try and make some sort of change. And then it took a long time after that.
Well, and the only reason I ask and I bring this up and want you to talk about it is one of the biggest themes on the podcast is education and growth. I think it's very important for people to know there's other people who have not only been through the same thing, but are now on the other end of it. So you mentioned that therapy was one of the things you had started. Was there anything else that helped you get to where you are now, 2 years into sobriety? Anything that was super crucial to your healing process?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's a number of things, right? And they're all pretty synchronistic, they kind of have to go together for me. And I think importantly, I appreciate you sharing that about yourself and sharing that with your listeners. And I think that we're all in a different place about how we relate to our relationship with our mental health or our mental unwellness. And the truth is, I know, of course, I know you, and I know you wouldn't bring that up to shame me, but somebody couldn't shame me with this stuff if they tried at this point in my life, because I've processed it and I'm accountable to it. Right. So, there's
absolutely,
naturally, when you're messed up, you're completely blackout messed up for 10 years of your life. When I was blackout messed up for 10 years of my life, I did some dumb stuff and I hurt some people's feelings. And, I've had to be accountable to that. And I've had to be really honest with myself that there is a part of me that, when sort of fertilized with drugs and alcohol, turns into a very unpredictable, very kind of scared, and therefore kind of scary person who lashes out at the world. For me, in terms of, my recovery, my relationship, to how I feel about my experiences as an addict in the past, I won't say that I experience sort of full-blown shame around it anymore, but I have moments of regret, or moments of I'm in my career and I'm having so much fun and it's beginning to, gain some legs. And I'm man, what if I'd been working this hard for 10 years? Where would I be right now? Kind of thing. And that kind of is tough to swallow sometimes, but I have to remind myself just to accept the situation as it is. And that's not the way it worked out. Right. But yeah, like I said, my relationship to that stuff can sort of ebb and flow in terms of some days I accept it fully. Some days I accept it a little bit less, and some days I have a really hard time accepting it. But at the end of the day, my relationship to my recovery and my commitment to being healthy, that doesn't change. That doesn't change any time, any day. I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that if I were to pick up a drink or a drug today, that would not live very long. And I just I know that because I was by the time I did kind of pack it all up and seek serious help, and which is to say, the time I went to rehab for the 5th time and got serious about it, finally, I made that commitment. Something changed in my life. And I just decided that the way I visualized it right at the beginning of being sober was I have these 2 sort of paths that I can walk in life. And they can be separated into these 2 distinct categories of the first being everything that I care about in life, all my values, my family, my relationship to my community, my art, my career, everything I love in the world. And then the other path, the other category, is drugs and alcohol. Mm-hmm. And I only get to pick one of them. I can't do both. And I know that because, like I said, I started playing music again in 2018, and then I relapsed, and I had a few periods of time before then where I had been sober for, a span of time here and there. But I guess I started playing music again, and I thought, I don't know that I consciously thought, okay, maybe I can do this while I drink, but I just fell back into I wasn't taking care of myself, and I fell back into old patterns and picked up. But, I had to think really long and hard at that time too. Like, what do I want this career to look like? Am I up for it? Can I do it? Can I do this as a sober person? And it turns out that I can. So, therapy was a huge part of that. You mentioned that you're on your own journey of sort of accepting and processing that stuff. And like, maybe this is silly advice, but like, write a record about it. Like, that helped me so much. Like, the day my last record was released, which is really sort of not an explicit account necessarily of everything that happened during that time, but it deals with the experiences I had during the depths of my addiction, for sure, and coming out of it. The day I released that album, I felt this incredible weight lifted off my shoulders, because
Right.
I'd put it on paper and then just sent it out into the cosmos, and now it's there for other people to sort of process and interpret however they see fit. It's not my shit anymore. If it resurfaces, I have to be honest about it and responsible about it and accountable to it. But it's time to move on. Like, I feel like I re-entered like the bloodstream of like real life, like what people do, which is like live honest and accountable lives, and wake up every day and try to survive in this messed up capitalist system that we live in, and treat people with kindness and respect, and just have the life that I want to have. So again, therapy was a big part of that. Surrounding myself with really positive people was a big part of that. I'm involved in a recovery community in that community, I've learned that the only way I can kind of maintain healthy and meaningful sobriety is to kind of pass on what I've been given through that community. So sort of supporting other people in their wellness. And certainly when it comes to music as a practice and as a career, like, I work with other artists who are healthy, positive people. And I'll tell you, like,
Mm-hmm.
I get asked all the time, isn't it hard to be a musician and be sober? And it's like, it's really not, because the only folks who have sustainable careers in music are healthy, or at least are open to working on their health, right? Like, a lot of the folks who maybe I did a lot of partying with, who have continued down that path, they're not playing music anymore. And I sincerely hope that one day they will be, but like, I wouldn't have been if I hadn't taken care of that stuff. So it's been, pretty strange to get back on my feet and then put in about 6 months of really hard with music, and then a pandemic hits and I have to like hit stop again. It felt very cruel at first, but it's been a pretty incredible experience, like, to really reflect on, like, why do I want to, when you take away all the glitz and glamour of the life of a working musician in Canada, of which there is very little. There's not a lot of glitz and glamour, right? But like, when you take away whatever amount exists, it's really just like, how committed am I to getting up every morning and working on writing a song? How committed am I to practicing my instruments? How committed am I to responding to these emails and, reaching out to my collaborators and organizing projects? And when really I could just kind of sit on the couch and read books all day or something like that. And it's been a period of really positive growth for me, for sure.
Well, and you mentioned too there your recovery group, and I think that's a perfect transition to end the talk here about addiction and the mental health stuff. Is what advice do you have for anyone listening who's maybe at the start of their battle, maybe recognizing what they're going through but haven't done anything about it yet? What advice would you have for someone?
I mean, the only thing that really worked for me after years of trying every single other thing was just being completely honest with every person that I had to be completely honest with. It didn't mean going around to, every single person in my life and telling them what was going on, but it was like, such a hard part of addiction is that, especially once you've sort of flirted with recovery, or like been part of a recovery community and then gone back to active addiction, is that things get really twisted and your relationships with people get really twisted. And a lot, for me, it had so much to do with dishonesty.
Mm-hmm.
It had to do with who in my community knows that I shouldn't be drinking, but I'm drinking. Who in my community knows that I'm drinking, but they don't know that I shouldn't be drinking. Who in my community knows that I shouldn't be drinking and they don't know that I'm drinking. All this complicated web of like constantly trying to navigate. And it's like no shit, I was going crazy, because it's like, I have to trying to keep track of all these different sort of dynamics, but like half the time I don't even remember who I've seen or what I've done, right? And
Right.
part of the concern I had, when I was so deep in it and was pretty psychotic, to be honest, was how do I own up to everybody? How do I get clean? Like how am I gonna clean up all these complicated situations? And it's the most simple answer, right? It's like, tell everyone the same story, tell everyone the truth. Let everyone know
Mhm.
I can't drink and I've been drinking again. They all already know, but like I don't wear it well. I can't hide it, but
Right.
like I thought I could. And it's like, I'm just was so deep in this stuff. So whatever your situation is, like so much a part of it is this, I would call a lot of that shame, right? And I would call that carrying a lot of guilt and carrying a lot of that sort of emotional baggage that seems like it's going to be impossible to contend with and deal with. But the first step for me was just calling somebody. For me, it was my mom, and just saying like, things are like bad, 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 and I need help. But this time, like, I am going to do whatever it takes, right? And
Mhm.
I think my mom had heard that from me enough times, but this was the first time, and she says this, as well, that if you're listening, hi mom, that there was some sincerity in my voice, right? Like that it was clear that I was like, no, this has got to end, right? And all those situations that I thought were going to be so hard to sort of clean up or have to go back and pick up the pieces and explain to people, it's just like, first of all, like I don't loom so largely in everybody else's psyche. Like everybody in my
Right.
life isn't thinking about me and my drinking all the time. But when you're lost in this world where you're always just sort of surveilling your own relationship to other people and how it's affected by your drinking, it's natural that one might start feeling that way.
Mhm.
So honesty with others, but then most importantly, sort of this honesty with myself, which was, I had to go from thinking I need to quit drinking to I don't drink anymore. And from I need to stop doing drugs to I do not do drugs anymore. And I'm going to do whatever it takes to make sure that I construct a sort of life around me where I don't desire to drink or do drugs any longer.
Right.
And that seemed at the beginning like an impossible feat.
Mhm.
But here I am 2 years later in my nice house with my nice family and my nice dog. And I got my nice car parked out back and it's got a nice tank full of gas, like it's like all this stuff that 2 years ago. And I guess we should mention, we haven't mentioned this, but you and I have known each other for a little
Yep.
while.
Yep.
And you met me at a sort of interesting time in my life where I had first kind of just got sober for a while and was pretty enthusiastic, at least in a superficial way, about my sobriety. But when the rug got pulled out from under me with other things in my life, I went right back to drinking and
Mhm.
doing drugs. And right now, if the rug got pulled out from underneath me, if things started outside of my personal health started going wrong, it wouldn't affect my personal health.
Yeah.
And if it did start affecting my personal health, I'd get on the phone and I'd be asking for help.
And I thank you for being so open and honest with us. And I never like to end an interview on such a heavy note. So, as we're coming to the end here, you actually released a new video EP today. That's very interesting because I mean, it's either one or the other nowadays. I feel people are either focused on the visual music side of things, like they'll release a music video once every 6 months, for example, let's say, or they just focus on putting out album after album. How did you land on doing such an interesting release, and what can you tell us about it?
It came together like I really just try to trust my instincts with projects and lean into sort of the ideas of my collaborators and create a lot of sort of equity in the decision making, but also like, through giving the people around me some autonomy and doing what they want to do and then coming together with all our ideas. So this project was definitely the product of a lot more people than just me, and definitely a product of the pandemic as well. I wasn't interested in doing the live stream thing.
Mm-hmm.
And now, I don't know if I'm going to do one because it seems like shows will be back at least, in the next couple of years.
Right.
But I didn't want to do a live stream, but I kind of wanted to give my audience something like that, and like I do love performing, of course. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I was really quite prolific, like even more than I normally am. Like I was writing like crazy, and not really intentional, not this sort of like I need to sit down and sort this out kind of thing. It just one of those, it was a season in my creative life where I was writing a lot, and so I had this batch of songs that were really sort of rooted in the sort of like folky kind of country western bluegrass stuff that I grew up playing,
Right. Yeah.
in my late teens at least. And I don't really have a band for that because my band that I tour with and the folks that I work with in the studio, we do, certainly more of a rock and roll kind of thing. or a take on rock music, I suppose. So I started thinking about maybe I should record a couple of these songs, maybe make a folk record, and then I thought, I need to make a video. I got to put out some videos maybe for folks who want that, and
Mm-hmm.
just sort of clicked that okay, maybe I should make some videos of these folk tunes, and then I thought maybe it'll just be me. And I reached out to Josh Lyons. Josh Lyon, he's a filmmaker here in Kingston, and just a really wonderful guy, great community member, and asked him if he had interest in working on a project like that, and he said absolutely. And then he suggested a few other names, and those names were Teilhard Frost and Jason Mercer, who are two amazing artists who live over on Wolf Island. Teilhard is sort of a just this really cool sort of polymath, creative fellow who does all sorts of interesting things. And he and I really connect on songwriting, and he likes what I do a lot. And really, one of those people who really affirms that I'm on the right track when we work together. And then Jason's sort of a recent transplant to the region. He's originally Canadian, but he came up from New York where he'd been working for a while. And he's a bass player and producer and engineer and banjo player as well. And just really, really great guy. And, a real pro and like a really good energy to be around. Super sweet dude. So we started just playing those tunes together. And then Josh came out and recorded them. And my buddy Liam Cole, who's a drummer, came over and played on it as well. And we did that, there was that period, Kingston's had this interesting sort of place in COVID where we've had a little more liberty than other parts of the country, like we've been in the green zone a lot more, which means we're able to actually get in a room with other people and do some stuff. We took it seriously. Like those of us who were involved with it, we all live in households with just a couple of people, and we bubbled for a few weeks so we could work on this project, which I'm pretty grateful to my friends, and these are new friends as well, that they would slim down the people they were seeing in their life just so they can record some live videos with me with no real sort of destination in place. We just recorded them and then didn't know what we were going to do with them. I thought maybe I'd release one at a time over a span of a few months. And I'm working with some new management now. And one of the folks I'm working with said, what do you think about this idea of like a video EP? Like put it out as though it's sort of a record but it's exclusive to YouTube. And I thought that was a really cool idea. So I hired a designer who's a woman from the region named Madison Reitz. She goes by No New Things Co. And I saw her work at a gift shop out in Gananoque when I was Christmas shopping, and just was like totally blown away by it. So reached out to her and asked her if she wanted to do design for that. And that's what really brought it together. It's like, once you've got a cover, it's a project, And so we released it as though it was sort of a record, but on YouTube as video. So it's 3 tunes that I wrote a year ago now at the beginning of the pandemic, and recorded in the autumn with this new group of collaborators, and just put out today.
That's amazing. And one of the things I really appreciate is you saying all the artists' names, because before we sat down, one of the things I had mentioned to you is I loved the artwork, and now I'll be able to listen back and actually check out their work. So I'd really appreciate that you've throughout that whole interview named people by name. I think that's great.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to me, as I benefit so much from these creative relationships, like personally and creatively, but also professionally. And it's important to me to certainly give credit where credit's due. It's a funny project because I go by my own name, but like I've long thought, and I think I'm kind of past the point of no return on this, but like for a while, like I thought it was pretty important to adopt a moniker that was sort of more, representative of this being a group of people who come and go and work on this music together, because, it might be my name on it, but like that doesn't really represent what's going on behind the scenes. I'm really grateful and extremely lucky to have just a really cool, supportive community of musicians from all across Canada now who can contribute to my work and contribute in a really meaningful way to my life. And the least I can do is mention their full names when I'm being interviewed.
Well, last question here for you today. What else can we expect from you this year? I know you said you're under management, so what can you share with us that we can expect from you this year?
Well, I'll be releasing another record this year, and that's about all I can share about it right now.
Fair enough, brother.
I mean personally, I plan to just like stay at home and to play backgammon and watch Studio Ghibli films until the pandemic's over, and write some tunes, and look forward to getting back to music. But I will have a project out, a record out this year.
Well, awesome. I look forward to hearing it when it's out. And Michael, thank you so much for being with us today and having such a honest and true conversation.
My pleasure, Austin. Thank you so much for having me.
Cheers, man. Catch you soon.